I think it was through this journey that we finally able to really see the people who would otherwise be labeled as encroachers in the national park as actually, you might call them forest dependent communities, or you can call them stewards of the earth. This is work that I do with my current organization, United in Diversity, and realizing that I'm giving a voice to such a vast story that is still unfolding. I hope this story conveys how sensing takes away your freedom not to act by moving that concept of intersectionality from just a head concept, a cognitive concept, to the heart, and then to your body and to the hands. Just a little bit of context. So we are based out of Indonesia. I believe and I feel it's a very important place and nation and people to our fight against climate change due to its sheer size, of course, but also because of the tremendous amount of biodiversity that we have. And we share this with 273 million people, 17 million of which are indigenous or Adat people. And there are about 568 that we know of. And of course, the home to all this is this irrecoverable carbon that resides in Indonesia's rainforests, peatlands, mangroves, and oceans. And so you can imagine the complexity that arises in such a place. I think a program like what we do on awareness-based systems change is critical and timely because we bring leaders from across sectors and really highlight that, your perspective can be very different from those across the system. There's power gap, there's imbalances, there's systemic injustice. And by bringing that not only in the classroom, but also outside of the classroom, and also with one another, using a different kind of awareness, the awareness of the earth body and the social body. And we use that to sense into the complexity of the relationships of the actors in the system, including the voiceless stakeholders, the future generations, wildlife, and Mother Earth, and our values, our highest future potentials are all there in the system for us to sense and feel into. So it was in one of these cohorts, in one of these programs, entered Pak Bambang Supriyanto. This was in 2015. And he was at the time the person in charge of managing national parks across Indonesia's 17,000 islands. And perhaps one question that was constantly bothering him in that role is that, why do I keep having conflicts with the people around the national park, in and around the national park? And some of them are indigenous peoples who we know now are at most at stake when it comes to climate effect. And so he had some key questions, and through the process of understanding and sensing into the system deeper, he came up with these questions. And I'm not going to go through each and every one of them one by one, but I just want to highlight that these questions perhaps range from the symptoms level to structures, but also to what can I do and what do I need to change, that source dimension of change. And it is these questions that he finally brought into the sensing activities into one of the national parks that he managed. And this is Taman Nasional Harimun Salak. It's one of the parks on Java, which is actually the most densely populated island in the world, at 140 million people, on a piece of land the size of New York State. And it was in this national park, there's a group of indigenous community, masyarakat Adat, who call themselves Kasapuan Cipta Gelar, almost 600 communities, about 8,000 families. And sensing is not about reading reports. If you go back to those questions, there are probably many studies that have been written about them, but it's not about just reading reports and studies. It's about bringing yourself to the place of most potential, knowing what being there can teach you when you arrive with an open mind, an open heart, and open will. And so this is Pak Bambang. I had the honor and the pleasure of accompanying this sensing journey, and we arrived to a very festive welcoming party in which he immediately took part in. We met with the village elder. I call him elder, but he's actually one of the youngest. His people call him Abah, which is the Sundanese for father, and this is his wife, Ama Arif. And by being there, just simply we these are things that you don't experience by reading reports or looking at your computer screen. We know now that they have this great big house at the village center, or at the village square, if you will, and the door is always open for anyone. It would be like a palace, but if the palace were open all the time to everyone that comes. And the kitchen is huge and massive, and this wood fire stove is always burning, always putting out food for whoever that comes to stop by. And we sat down with the elders and we learned to listen. And this is the part, I think, that was, you have to come to terms face to face with the pain and suffering, because suddenly now we're hearing that, there's this ministry and nation state that is about 70 years old, imposing laws and outlawing people who have been in the area for about 500 or 600 years. So their oldest oral history dates back to the year 1368. And realizing that actually when they ask for road, it's not to open up more forest. When they ask for road, it's because their women are dying in childbirth all on the way to the healthcare facility. It's because their children don't have access to good education. And it is with these understanding that we then go into their village and their communities to learn more about their way of life. Their roads are hand built collectively. It's a very communal society, and everyone has a role, and everything is governed by a communal schedule. And we learned about the happiness of its people. And we learned about their relationship with rice. Rice is sacred, and it's their connection with the gracefulness, with the bounty of Mother Earth. And rice is sacred, and even though you have an abundance, you do not sell. They only plant 6 months out of the year, and they don't plant twice, even though they could, because the soil needs to rest, and the people need to be with their family. And every year, they have a tradition of storing their harvest and their traditional barns. Every family has one, every village has one, and their whole community has this central barn in which all the rice harvest gets stored into. So they essentially established a seed bank. And science comes along and say, oh, apparently this area has the highest diversity of wild type rice, 160 varieties that we know of and counting. We shared meal. This is actually our second day there was Pabambang's birthday, and we celebrated with Abah and Ama. I think it was through this journey that we finally able to really see the people who would otherwise be labeled as encroachers in the national park as actually, you might call them forest dependent communities, or you can call them stewards of the earth, right? Because they inherently know that their lives, their future generations are so interconnected with nature, and that it's in their best interest and the future generations' interest to keep it in good shape. So this is their rice barns, and this is their rice irrigation system. And they know that to keep water flowing from the top, you have to keep the mountaintops forested. And they have zonation system that's far more advanced than what we know about the core, the zoning area of national parks. So they know where to put their houses, they know where to put their rice fields and vegetables. They designate as sacred the lands that are not to be disturbed for any reason. And which actually leads to a common understanding for this person whose role is to manage national parks, actually has the same goal. We're protecting national parks so that we have this piece of land for future generations to come. And it was this mutual understanding, this shared intention, this shared awareness of a common vision that allows, in witnessed by the village elders on the spot. Agreement was reached, and Pabambang actually made the gracious promise and support that, okay, we realize where we stand, and we need to make room in the system for indigenous people, for Adat people to coexist and thrive. And that started with, for example, helping to transcribe their customary laws into written laws, and providing support for education and healthcare and access to better, more sustainable livelihoods. And so this 5 years ago. And I think, once you see it, sensing allows you to see in a way that you cannot unsee. And it takes away your freedom not to act. I think that's probably what happened to Pabambang, because we came back from that trip and he actually went on, over the next 5 years to one, write the technical guidance for facilitators under his team to work with indigenous communities across the nation on how to work with them so that they can understand and see eye to eye and give proper recognition to these stewards of the lands to manage their own resources and determine their own future. And Pabambang is now the Director General of Social Forestry and Environmental Partnership 5 years later. And he is now the person in charge of giving the recognition to the indigenous communities that started from this sensing learning 5 years ago. And it is now a ministerial decree. The president of Indonesia, I think this was in 2017, perhaps finally giving recognition and allowing the freedom of indigenous people to exist in their land and continue to be stewards for future generations, not just for their future generations, but for our future generations. There's so much more complexity behind the story. Even if we did this all right, this is still a drop in the bucket, and there will still be many, many more examples of complexities that arises out of a huge, massive government system, working in silo, and so on and so forth. But I think this at least shows one path that we can all do of taking ourselves out of our habitual way of understanding the world, and with an openness of mind and heart and will into places of most potential that allows us the courage to lose the freedom not to act.